Well, hello. Today our lectionary reading for the 7th of February. The Gospel reading is Mark chapter 1 verses 29 through to 39. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening, at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick and possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighbouring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." And he went out throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. In last week's reading, we had the preceding text to this one, and it was Jesus' first act of public ministry as we find it in Mark's Gospel. And in it he encounters a man with an unclean spirit. This was Jesus' first real test. It's his first Sunday in the synagogue, or Sabbath in the synagogue, and he encounters this man with an unclean spirit, and he heals him. Now we've just picked up the narrative immediately afterward, and he's just left the synagogue. This is just the back story to what we read today. He leaves the synagogue and heads to the home of Simon and Andrew, with James and John in tow. This house is presumably known to them because they're business partners, as I've said before. And so I wonder, is it their business headquarters? It could well be. But this is the place they go, the home of the two brothers of Andrew and of Simon. We discover that Simon is married. He has to be, because he has a mother-in-law. So that assumes that he also has a wife. And this kind of brings a different lens to his life, because we never hear about his wife, except in 1 Corinthians 9 and 5 again, that his wife travels with him. This is later. But we know nothing about his family, whether he had children, if he did, how many there were, what became of any of them. It's always just a small part of the story that we're told. And it's important to recognize this often about the biblical narrative. We're only given often the bare bones. We might have the details of a particular incident, but there's so much that we don't know. And that provides us with a measure of license at one level to be creative and imaginative, although we need to be very careful and very clear that that's what we're actually doing. But it also leaves the whole thing very open, which I think is also useful. So we see Jesus here coming in, and he heals Peter's mother-in-law. She gets up, presumably to make dinner. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that that was the only reason that they wanted her healed. My confidence is that Jesus would have healed her irrespective. It would have made no difference. So she had a fever, and she's restored, and she gets up to serve. We discover in the story that good news travels fast. Bad news travels fast, but good news also travels fast. The whole town gathers at the door that evening. The whole town, everybody's there. And what this is pointing to me is that these people are hungry. They're hungry for healing. They're hungry for a sense of significance. They're hungry for hope. They have a deep yearning that there can be more in life than what they're experiencing. It seems to me that it's really no different today. Many of us hear and we experience that gnawing hunger in our souls. How often do you wake up in the small hours of the morning with a sense of disquiet, a sense of discomfort, with things rattling around in your heart and in your head, with just a worry about what's going to happen next, and wanting to know that you're okay and that everything's going to be fine? And how many of us reach for our phones? Seriously? Reach for our phones and click onto Facebook or onto, and for me it's Flipboard, which is a news channel, and find out what's going on in the world. You know, we have this capacity to distract ourselves. We use the media, we can use our work, we use entertainment, sport, we can even use our relationships to distract ourselves from that gnawing hunger within us, within our souls, that says that actually life could be more than it is. And so here we have all these people that realize that Jesus has an answer, perhaps the answer, to discover in fact that he is the answer. I'm just imagining if the church today could evoke that sort of interest, could tap into that kind of yearning to recognize this deep existential need that we all have, and be able to point the way and be able to meet it in some way. That people would, as they meet with us, encounter the same Jesus. That people would go away freed, people would go away healed, people would go away with a sense of hope and purpose for the day and for the week ahead. Anyway, let's just pick up the text, verse 34. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. Well, we're back to demons. Demon possession, or demon influence, or unclean spirits seems to be very common in the time of Jesus. Particularly in Mark's Gospel, you go through the Gospels, you see it coming up again and again and again. And it's kind of awkward and embarrassing. It is for me, because it's not part of my experience. It simply isn't. I can't say that I've ever met anybody in my 65 years who fits in any of the descriptions, really. Particularly with some of the more extreme forms, like the demoniacs who run naked around the graveyards. I've not seen or experienced anything like that. And yet, one of the things that comes into the same category is what we would see today as epilepsy, and is described and being attributed to an unclean spirit. And yet today we have a much clearer understanding of what's going on inside the brain when it fits, and that it's controllable, and for some people it's ultimately curable. And it's hard to kind of attribute it to evil spirits at all. I'm not saying that evil spirits aren't at work, that aren't present. As I say, we have other ways that we can deal with these things. I've completed a series on Matthew, which I started during the lockdown. There were 220 episodes. Episode 128, which I put up on the 20th of August 2020, actually looks at the question of epilepsy. It was part of the text, where this boy would go into a fit and be thrown into the fire and have to be rescued by his parents. And so I talk about it there. So if you wanted to just hear a bit more, it might be worth checking that out, episode 128 on the 20th of August. So the question I have is that, and I think it's the thing that we maybe is useful for us, is to ask the question, how would one describe this in a more primitive society than the one in which we live? We're talking about 2 millennia later, where we have huge scientific advances, where we have huge diagnostic equipment to be able to scan and to be able to look at what's going on. We have a much better understanding of a lot of things. And the issue of the demoniac is, I would suggest to you, covered largely by our mental health services, which is why we don't see it just manifesting in the streets. Schizophrenia would probably be the most obvious and common expression of what they would have seen back in their day. Now, we don't come across this commonly in our community because people are treated. I have a young man who's been living in our household for the last 10 years who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He is under control. He takes his treatment and he seems to be fine. As I say, we don't see it commonly in the people around us. Yet it seems that in the time of Jesus they were everywhere, and almost as if it was the most common issue that Jesus needed to be dealing with. And so I want to suggest that it needs to be understood in the context of the time and in the context of their worldview. They could not have attempted to describe what they saw as a psychosis or schizophrenia in the way that we understand it today. They had ways of describing their experience. For example, they would talk about the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. Now, we still do, because that's what it looks like to us is happening. We know that from a much bigger narrative, that is not what's happening at all. But that is what it looks like. That is our experience. I've reflected on Jesus ascending to heaven at the end of the 40 days after the resurrection. Jesus ascends into the clouds. And does this mean that heaven is up there? No. I don't believe so. But it's what they believed. It's what they thought. It's how they saw the universe. They saw themselves living on a flat earth and heaven was up there. So to see Jesus ascend indicated to him that he was going away and they would not expect to keep bumping into him as they had been for the previous 40 days. Now, the way that he came and went is an indication to me of where heaven is. It's actually right here among us. It is presented, I'd suggest to you, as an alternative reality. It's something that we can't see or apprehend, but it's with us, it's here. That's just speculation on my part, but that's my hunch about it. And so, here we see living with a different worldview, so that psychiatrists today mostly would see the issue of what the church historically would call the demoniac in terms of mental illness. There's a few that will see a distinction, mostly not. Is exorcism appropriate? Well, the mind is a very complex organ, and if it helps, fine. And I don't doubt that there are people who actually are healed and who are delivered. Because of course God can and does heal, just the same as for physical ailments. Jesus healed the woman with the issue of blood. He healed the blind, he healed the deaf, he healed the paralyzed. You name it, he healed it. Why not heal illnesses of the mind? Does this mean that I'm saying that demons aren't real? No, I'm not saying that. It may be that they're constantly at work. It's just that they're not scientifically identifiable. It doesn't mean that they're not real. To me, it's kind of like the miracle of conception. We see it. It's the most common thing in the world. New life is being created all the time. Yet I want to suggest to you, it seems to me that it's a miracle every time that it happens, the creation of new life. But just because it's common and it's everywhere doesn't mean it isn't miraculous. I hope Do you understand what I'm saying? There's something that is so present and that I don't think we have an adequate explanation for it. And I'm not sure that we ever will. It's kind of miraculous. You're welcome to disagree. But I wonder if there are kind of influences that are involved, because I think that God is involved every time. There could be influences that are involved that we just don't see. It doesn't mean that they aren't real. In the end, I need to say that the issue of the demonic is beyond my experience. So it may be simply cheeky on my part to even attempt to talk about it. Except that I see the text and I think, I can't avoid this forever. So let's dive in. And that's where I end up. As I said, you're actually more than welcome to disagree with me. I'll be interested to see your comments. I'm interested too, though, that Jesus prevents the demons from speaking. It becomes a pattern. After the first one, he stops them from speaking. And we might ask ourselves why. I want to suggest a possibility. And that is that he tells the truth about Jesus, and he also lies about God. In his previous encounter, the unclean spirit speaks. You are the Holy One of God. You have come to destroy us. And what we discover as we hear the demons speaking in the Gospels is that fear is a significant factor. We see it again and again in Jesus' encounters with the demonic. They are afraid of Jesus. You have come to destroy us. They're terrified of what he might do to them. Now I want to make a suggestion, and this may be stretching a long bow. One of my favourite authors of 20 years ago was psychiatrist Irvin Yalom. Yalom at the time was professor of psychiatry. He had been for many years at Stanford University. And I've read a lot of his books. The most expensive book I ever bought, which he wrote, was called Existential Psychotherapy. It was published in 1980, so it's 40 years old, so it may be seriously out of date. And yet I think there are things in it that he has to say that are very up-to-date and very contemporary. He suggests that there are 4 primary issues that human beings need to attend to in order to be whole, in order to be healthy. The first of the 4, which takes up half of the book, is the fear of death. The next 3 are the fear of freedom, isolation, the fear of aloneness, and the 4th one is he looks at the question of meaninglessness. And the fear of death is the biggie. It's certainly the biggie for Yalom. A lot of his writings is about that particular issue. He's not a Christian. I think he probably, with a name like Yalom, would come from Jewish roots. He's an atheist, but the fear of death actually figures large. And he's quite clear that all anxiety disorders, which I'm familiar with, are rooted in fear of death. He suggests that schizophrenia is also rooted ultimately in a fear of death. It's ultimately an escape into unreality because of the fear of death. And that healing becomes possible when the reality of death is accepted. Radical, eh? That brings us to this text. There's a deep terror here. A terror in the heart of the demonic, rooted in the idea that God is against us. And so we see these truth mixed with lies, that they knew who Jesus was, but they feared that Jesus' purpose was to destroy them. Underpinning it is this idea that God is not good, because ultimately everyone dies. So which are we to believe? That Jesus is the Holy One of God and that's potentially a good thing? Or that God is evil and bent on our destruction? Maybe both are true. What do we believe? It's a very contemporary problem in the day of fake news. We see it around us. So Jesus is actually just shutting down the kind of tension with this truth mixed with lies. The desire of Jesus is for all of us to be healed, to be set free. He wants our wholeness. He wants our freedom. He wants our liveliness in life. That's why he came. So I think that it's useful to understand him dealing with the demonic in that context. It's a quest for richness, for freedom, for wholeness of life. And finally, we come to the last section of the text. And we see Jesus going off to pray. And he goes by himself. And we discover that as a result of this, there's a kind of course correction for him. That as Jesus prays, he's resolved to move on. He's got places to go. He's got people to see. Sure, the people in Capernaum are happy to have him as their personal chaplain. It's temptation to be comfortable, to be increasingly known and safe. As a person who's been in the same parish for 26 years, I actually get that. I understand that. Yet Jesus is aware of a larger vision, of a larger call on his life. And he needs to move on. And he does. Into uncertainty, yet also into richness. Richness of life, richness of ministry. The known is safe. And it's fine for a while. But it can be a trap. And can keep us from all that we might become. Sometimes we need to set out to risk ourselves. And we come back to the theme that we've been talking about a few moments ago. What prevents us? In one way or another, I want to suggest when we boil it down, it comes back to Yalom's fear of death. It is. We can ask ourselves, what's the worst that could happen? Perhaps the worst that can happen is that we might die. And if we're okay with that, if we know that we have put our hand in God's hand, that our life is held secure in God's grasp, and that it will end appropriately in God's time, and we're okay with that, then we'll be just fine. We'll be just fine. God bless you.